Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. I hope you had a bite. I know it was very crowded at the lunch cafe. You managed to get something to eat. We are a bit running a little late, so maybe we can start now while other colleagues may join. As you know, today, this session, we are focusing on how can national evaluations ensure accountable governance, and how can we strengthen the interface between national policy evaluations and governance processes, and what are the areas that needs focus and acceleration. So to discuss this, we have an excellent panel today. Two of them are here with us, and two of them are joining us virtually. From Sarah Lister from New York and Hur Hassanin from London. It's my pleasure to briefly introduce Jörg Forst, who is here to my right, who is the director of the German Institute for Development Evaluation and is a professor of political science at the University of Duisburg-Essen. His research and evaluation focus on bilateral and multilateral development cooperation, political determinants of economic development, democratization, decentralization, fragile states, and conflict studies. Jörg has extensive experience in implementing and managing complex research and evaluations. Next to Jörg is Flavia Schmidt, a director of advanced studies and vice president at the National School of Public Administration in Brazil. She's also a senior researcher in public policy. Flavia also worked at the largest Brazilian government think tank, the Institute for Applied Economic Research, IPEA. Flavia has a PhD in business administration. Let me now introduce the panelists who is joining virtually. Sarah Lister is the head of the governance and oversees the policy and program at UNDP in New York. Sarah has extensive experience working on democratic governance, including civic engagement, media and communication, social accountability, public administration reforms, and governance measurement. Prior to her current position, Sarah was the director of the UNDP's Oslo Governance Center, with bridges, research, policy, and practice on governance and peace building, with a particular emphasis on SDG 16. And the other virtual panelist is Hur Hassanin, also a senior evaluation advisor, European Commission DG INTPA, Evaluation Support Services in Brussels. Is the founder of the Pakistan Evaluation Association and treasurer at the International Evaluation Academy. Hur has extensive evaluation experience at the international level, particularly in fragile context. He is the lead author of the Ideas book, Evaluation in the Context of Fragility, Conflict, and Violence, published last year. Excellent book, please check it out. It's my pleasure to welcome all the panelists to this discussion. Before I turn to the panelists, let me very quickly explain to you how we are organizing this session. I will start with a few remarks on my part as the moderator of this session. Then we'll have 3 questions. Each of the panelists will respond for 3 minutes each. And after the 3 questions, 3 rounds of the panelists, we will have a participants round, and then the panelists will come back and respond to the participants' question. Then we'll have another round of the participants. Again, the panelists will respond to those questions, and then we will have a concluding remarks round. Without much delay, let me share a few thoughts on this subject. We all agree that policy and development evaluations are crucial for improving and strengthening governance processes, as it promotes public accountability and transparency and contributes to citizens' trust in the government decisions and actions. Evaluations and related data and analysis have the potential to ensure that the public decisions are rooted in evidence and deliver the desired outcomes for the national institutions. But all of this is based on several assumptions. We are assuming that there are going to be evaluations at the national level. We are assuming that these evaluations are going to be periodic and of good quality. And we are also making this big assumption that these evaluations will be linked to the policy loops. But we all know here that that's not often the case at the country level. And there are many challenges in ensuring evaluations and linking them to the policy processes. But the question we would like to bring into this panel discussion is that how can we then accelerate national policy evaluation ecosystems to strengthen public sector governance and democratic institutions and processes? What is this link and how do we take this forward? I would like to share with you in 2015, the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP, the office where I come from, we carried an assessment of 40 countries across the regions to assess the status of national evaluation systems. And we found that the picture is very varied and it's not a uniform thing. We came up with, I think there were 3 patterns we noted. One is the mature context where the evaluation systems are very well developed. The data systems are very well developed. It's a very state-of-the-art development data systems, and the evaluations are mainstreamed across the government institutions, and they periodically conducted the evaluations and linked it to the policy processes. The other 2 are the evolving and emergent context. In the evolving context, there is an enabling environment for evaluation and national evaluation systems, but they are very elementary. And even the national statistics and data is only collected for only a set of variables. So it is still a work in progress, although there's an orientation towards data and evaluation. In the case of emergent systems, everything is very basic. They are still in the process of orienting themselves to evaluations. Data systems and statistics are very rudimentary. We found that most countries are in the evolving and emergent kind of context. And there's a lot of work that need to be done to get them move towards more mature context. I must bring your attention to a more recent study of OECD, which was published in 2020, which also did about 45 countries assessment. And they came to the similar conclusion that national evaluation systems are still evolving, and there's a long way to go before independent evaluations that are conducted and linked to policy processes, and where countries can be confident about their data systems. So over a period, we see that things are evolving, but not at a pace which we wanted to see them to develop. And there seems to be a large gap when we think about their interface with institutional processes and governance processes. A related issue, which seems to be a no-brainer, is that we found where institutions are very well developed, where systems of transparency and accountability are very well established, automatically the national evaluation systems were very well established. These are the mature contexts. And evolving and emergent contexts are weak in terms of institutions. They're still struggling with reforms such as right to information, accountability, and transparency. Although it might seem obvious, but this pattern seemed to be evident. And this is something actually I would like to bring into this discussion. Also, in conference like this, when we all evaluators meet here, or those interested in evaluations meet, we always want to set up an evaluation system. But we all realize that there are already other oversight mechanisms at the country level. For example, many countries which may not even have an evaluation system has very well established audit mechanisms. What is the interface of such audit mechanisms with governance processes and transparency and accountability mechanisms? Can evaluations leverage audit processes and mechanisms at the country level to accelerate some of the evaluation ecosystems and culture is something which I would like to highlight. My last point is about the different contexts we are talking about and the incentives that are needed, we do realize that the incentives that are needed for example, countries emerging out of conflict and those in conflict. In the morning plenary session, we heard the example of a car. Some of these countries, the challenges are different from, for example, middle income countries in the development context, or the least developed countries in conflict context. So what are the incentive systems that are needed for countries in these different kinds of development pathways? And how do we identify those incentives, and how do we prioritize those incentives is something which I would like to flag. Last and related point is that we have countries of different geographical size. We have Macedonias of the world to the Brazils and the Indias and the Chinas of the world. And we need to think about solutions that are also federal evaluation solutions and more decentralized evaluation solutions. And probably it will be good to know from our esteemed panel their insights on some of these issues. So now let me turn to our panelists with my first question, which is the underlying principles of governance, such as accountability and transparency processes, complement public policy evaluation. What do you think is the linkage you see between the two at the country level? Let me start with Jorg. Jorg, can you please start the discussion?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, is the mic on? Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And my answer to this question is, of course, yes, but it's a more complicated yes, because I think between evaluation capacity development or the establishment of evaluation systems on the one hand, and accountability, democracy, transparency on the other hand, there is a relation characterized by endogeneity. And for explaining this, I think we should look at the big picture, the big environment, and there we see that in current times there's a certain paradox. So on the one hand, we see mounting evidence from social research, for instance, that increasing levels of governance, of democracy, cause a welfare dividend in terms of many indicators of social and economic well-being. So more democracy, more liberal democracy causes more well-being. But at the same time, we see, according to all indicators, that the worldwide status of democracy, accountability, and transparency is under attack. So as the most prominent indicators anonymously show, democracy levels have been declining during the last 10 or 15 years. So where we had a majority of democracies in 2008 or 2009, today worldwide we have a minority of democracies. We have lowering levels of democracy. And this is often not so much caused by violent coups d'etats or bloody revolution, but it's caused more by a gradual shrinking spaces for civil society, for free research, for free media, for meritocratic governance mechanisms, for shrinking spaces also for evaluation. So it's caused by constraints on judicial independence, it's caused by electoral engineering. And against this background of declining democracy and governance levels, there are actually two potential perspectives on the future of the involvement of evaluation systems or on the future of evaluation capacity development in an international context of democratic regression. And those perspectives both link democracy on the one hand and evaluation on the other hand, systems on the other hand. So there's the confident perspective, which highlights evaluation capacity development as an important, as a suitable means for supporting democratic governance, for supporting democratic accountability. And in such a positive scenario, ECD is considered as an independent instrument that combines technocratic and participatory elements for improving public policy. So it's a good evaluation system which improves public policy at the end of the day. This is the nice picture, yeah, we all would love to see. Yeah, and in this regard, one can say that ECD measures, all our attempts to improve evaluation systems, they not only aim at fostering standards for technocratic evaluation management, for technocratic methods, but they also might establish a more politically relevant principles such as transparency and stakeholder involvement. Now, there is unfortunately also the gloomy perspective. And here, in a regressive democratic environment, ECD becomes increasingly threatened, given that autocratization will shrink the technocratic and political spaces which are necessary for successfully institutionalizing and consolidating functional evaluation systems. So if you live in an increasingly autocratic environment, there are no good prospects for establishing a functional, independent evaluation systems. And according to such a perspective, institutionalizing evidence-based policymaking through independent evaluation is increasingly being challenged by political polarization and institutional attacks. So two potential linkages. One is more a positive perspective, and the second one is more gloomy, but from my perspective, a more realistic linkage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg. Flavia, can I turn to you?
Thank you, Vijaya, for your kind introduction. Hello to people watching us. And I liked very much the talk on democratic backsliding that Jörg just mentioned. But I'd like to make some considerations about transparency. I think transparency is a starting point for a functional evaluation system, and also a last, if you think about that regular policy cycle that is at least prescribed by books and literature. Transparency allows more evaluation to be performed inside government, but also outside government by independent institutions, universities, think tanks, research centers, civil society organizations. And transparency should also allow society to track follow-up efforts inside governments about the recommendations of evaluations. I think in a context of democratic backsliding, we have such a lot of worries about how the findings of evaluations will be in fact symbolic, or will there be an effective use inside the policy cycle. So I believe we should start with transparency, but we should also conclude with transparency when you're talking about evaluation. And I'd like to bring the interesting topic that Vijay brought about the audit systems that are in place. In fact, I believe lots of countries have advanced a lot in establishing very robust audit systems. But I'd like to put here a remark on a potential danger that might be present in this configuration. I think that some institutional arrangements in place, balancing evaluation and audit systems, and also innovation in public policies should be considered, because there are some arrangements in which, when the bureaucrats tend to see evaluation as something more close to audit systems than to the policy cycle, I think it can be dangerous. So you can prevent bureaucracy from taking upon innovations in their policies, because it's much more comfortable not to do anything new, because if they do anything new, they will be more exposed to the audit systems. In Brazil, we have this kind of discussion going on just right now. People say that the approach of the audit systems is so strong that it has been preventing bureaucracy from doing something better in regards to public policy. So I think they should not always be comparable. They should be balanced, because if you associate evaluation only with audits and control, you tend not to incorporate it effectively in your work in policymaking. And I think that's all. I think I'd like to hear more from the other panelists and then come back to this point.
Thank you so much, Flavia. Can I now turn to Sarah? Sarah, can you also bring in a little bit of perspective, also the data, how it helps transparency, and other issues you would like to highlight?
Sure, and maybe we can also get onto that a bit later in the conversation as well. But you know, thank you for inviting me to this really interesting discussion, and I'd like to pick up really on some of the points that Jörg made in his you know, his comments also, because I think from UNDP's perspective, we also are looking at this democratic governance as a system. With various different entry points, and evaluation and monitoring plays an important role in that system in supporting public policy. But if I could perhaps challenge the typology that you presented at the beginning, Vijay, a little bit, and draw from what Jörg said, it's not always the case that in these days that those with strong public administration and strong evaluation capacities necessarily have a smooth route to public evidence-based public policy making. And I think we are seeing that more than ever, not just in the countries in which UNDP works, but also in, you know, across a range of other countries as well. That there is no long, in a very potentially toxic political environment. Jörg talks about democratization, autocratization, that is part of the picture. That's not the only part of the picture from my perspective. It is not simply a question of having strong evaluation systems and the mechanisms of ensuring that data and that analysis is influencing public policy. You know, the loops that you talk about. The loops, as we all know, are highly political, but they also rely on the broader democratic environment, which I think is what Jörg was referring to as well. So while at UNDP we are you know, supporting national evaluation capacities in various contexts in relation to supporting our partner governments with center of government functions and sectoral functions and all the rest, we are also increasingly looking across governance systems and across democratic governance systems and saying, where is the entry points, and Flavia was referring to this as well, where are the entry points for strengthening those principles of democracy, transparency and accountability, of which evidence is part of it, but we also need to be looking at parliaments, for example, and parliaments' capacity to be exercising effective oversight. Flavia mentioned the audit institutions. From my perspective, I would also hope we have an opportunity to talk about citizen engagement in these processes as well, and citizens' capacity to take on board data and analysis and engage in public policy. So really, from our perspective, we are broadening out from a focus just on formal evaluation systems and how they feed into formal public policy processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hoor, over to you for your round of observations.
Thank you, Vijay. I don't know what to say after my other esteemed panelists have said already, but yeah, I mean, very much agree with Sarah's point around the inclusive governance, citizen participation, etc. I think I will talk about it more later on, but I think indeed that's the way forward. I mean, just a point that governance in broad sense may mean management. And there is a famous quote that you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And when we talk about the nexus between measuring programs, policy making, or implementing policies and evaluation, especially in contexts that are fragile or conflict affected, as Vijaya mentioned earlier, that's my forte, as the area I specialize in. This connection is either very weak or non-existent. And this is evidenced by the 2017 SDG 16 progress report by the Institute for Economics and Peace, which mentioned that only 16% of the fragile countries could report somehow on the MDG indicators. And that's like when the Millennium Development Goal was concluded in 2015, and the evaluator started looking at the progress made by different countries. So the remainder, 84% of the countries could not report on the indicators, or they didn't even have any data available. And this is highly attributed to the fact that they did not have any monitoring and evaluation system in place, or even if they had, the tools are actually designed in developed countries and without realizing the context. So you need to adapt those tools and methods in that context. And the importance of this is, I won't say very much on this, but then I have an example very recently from Pakistan. Just a couple of months ago, the country had gone through one of its biggest climate crisis ever, where due to the increase in the monsoon rains, and about 35 million people got displaced, and 35 million is almost equal to 3 times the total population of Belgium as a country. So it's a very big number. But if we look back, and we see like similar kind of climate crisis happened, the flood crisis in 2010 in the country. And as a result of which, some international aid agencies and the government, like Ministry of Climate Change, created a policy. They developed a policy, it's called National Climate Change Policy. It was launched in 2012. And I mean, if you look back, as far as my information is concerned, there is no evaluation done. The evaluation, the policy, if you look at it, talks about forestation, it talks about water channeling, it talks about reservoirs and etc. All the good things one could talk about it. But then, I mean, it was kind of somehow evidence-based, but then how are we making sure that this policy implementation is being evaluated? So that is a kind of a thing. But in a general context, if we come out of the fragile countries, you know, there are some measures that are currently being taken place. I mean, one is this IIT, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, and the other one is the Publish What You Fund. They're making some good progress in making sure transparency is there, making sure the international aid is available at like public platforms, and a very strong focus on evaluation, like giving points on evaluation, reports being available online, for public eyes. Thank you. I'll conclude it here.
Thank you very much to all four of you for this very first round of excellent comments. I think, although the second question is on factors, I think you all started each one raising some of the factors. But if we can go into another round, because if we talk about democracy is declining, I think that seems to be a challenge, like Sarah and Yog and all of you pointed out, that it's across the gamut of countries that seems to be a challenge. But how can we find neutral spaces to promote some of these, some of the culture of evaluation and more transparent governance processes? But more broadly, what are the factors that would accelerate evaluation progress? And what can be prioritized among them? Can I start with you, Sarah?
Yes, you can start with me, and I'm sorry, but I'm sorry, there was just a mouse issue going on there. So I think that there's a number of entry points here. As you say, we all started talking about them. I mean, supporting data, which was something that you referenced, is obviously one of the entry points. There remains a critical lack of data, as Hoa was mentioning, across a range of issues and on SDG 16 issues particularly. There does need, obviously, to be comprehensive and periodic data on the supply side of governance and on the demand side of governance. And there needs to be the capacity to draw on multiple sources of information from across government agencies, Parliament, civil society, private sector, and there needs to be the technological and analytical capacities to aggregate this information and generate projections to anticipate and adapt to changes. I know we're talking about evaluation here, and I'm aware that I'm amongst a lot of evaluators, but we are always, in my job, looking forward and looking at how we are emphasizing change in the future. And from UNDP's perspective, maybe I'll just give a quick sort of overview of different levels where we're supporting that data piece, and then hand over to other panelists to add. So it's not just national data systems at the subnational level. We are supporting various mechanisms, including social innovation platforms, which bring together local sources of data for joint problem solving, but for transparency, for accountability, for social accountability and people's engagement in policy processes. At the national level, we have multiple entry points. For example, in the Philippines, UNDP is supporting the PINTIG lab, which is a multidisciplinary network using non-traditional data sources and involving data scientists and epidemiologists and a range of disciplines. Through an initiative in Latin America called SIGOP, we have for many years, probably decades, been supporting the aggregation, segregation, analysis of data and integration of multiple M&E platforms such as national statistics, administrative data, household surveys, and so forth to support government functioning and government systems. And then at the global level, UNDP also has the role as a custodian within the intergovernmental system of a number of SDG 16 indicators on peaceful, just and inclusive societies, referring to issues such as public satisfaction in service delivery and inclusion in decision making. And there is a whole mechanism around which we have supported the methodology of collection and reporting on that, and we are supporting, to the best of our ability and with the capacities available, national statistical officers to be collecting that data. So just a quick pitch on the data side. There are other entry points, but maybe other panelists will want to come in on that.
Yes, thank you. I think on the one hand, the question was on how we we create progress in emerging evaluation systems or in maturing evaluation systems. What factors? So if I would know, I would not tell you, but rather sell it as a consultant. And the price would not be the lowest, but I can guess. And my point is that I think what is not so important is the supply side. So we have a lot of international donors. We have DIVAL and Global Evaluation Initiative and UNDP and the World Bank, and they all offer great evaluation capacity development systems. The problem is the demand side. And I think we can differentiate between two or three types of important factors. One I would say is our structural ones. This is about the general modernization level of state and society. So where there is not a complex bureaucracy, where there is instability, where there is no modernization no certain critical level of modernization, it will be hard to establish. There will be no demand for a complex evaluation system, and we have to be realistic about that. Yeah? And then there are other priorities in such countries than building up a complex evaluation system. The other thing, the second one, is the institutional factors. Do we have institutions in place which guarantee accountability, which demand evidence? Is there a constitution which asks for evaluation? Are there laws around, which open up certain regulatory spaces where we can enter, and create a certain institutional improvements with regard to evaluation systems? And the third factor, it's at the micro level. It's at the level of actors. And they are often important because an incoming government, there might be a minister who is interested in evaluation. He comes from a public administration school. He did his PhD with Flavia, and he knows what evaluation is. And he is interested. And now in a given situation, he demands something. So this is a very, very special window of opportunity. And these window of opportunities are kind of made by actors which in a certain moment kind of want to change something at the political level. We see some countries where we have schools of politicians entering. The Chicago boys are most famous probably, but we have others, which kind of come from certain schools. They have these ideas about new public management or whatever, about planning, and they come in with these ideas and they ask us, they ask UNDP, and they ask DIVAL, now we want an evaluation system in place. So it's at the actor level where sometimes they are opening up windows of opportunity. So in principle, the two sentences: without modernization or certain levels of modernization, it will be very hard, even impossible, to create progress in emerging evaluation systems. And to have progress in maturing evaluation systems, I think we need a window of opportunity combined by the institutional setup and the concrete demand of certain political actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg. I know I'm an evaluator and we are in an evaluation conference amidst the several evaluators, but I will agree with you, there will be no demand for complex evaluation systems. And if we can bring in her about the context, like in conflict, where even the demand for resources, whether it's human or financial resources, is so intense with conflicting priorities. How do you see that, Hur?
Yeah, I mean, I love the way Jörg has, classified the demand and supply side of things. I would actually put them as, when I start thinking about the conflict and fragile context, like the soft components and the hard components that influence this slow progress in emerging or emergent environments. And as majority of us are evaluators here. The fluidity and unpredictability of the context. And I think some of you, if you have read the IDEA's book on evaluation of fragility, conflict, and violence that Vijaya mentioned earlier, the key message is that the context is the starting point. But if the context is so rapidly changing, how would you adapt to such situations? If you think about the governance mechanism, the stability is at stake, multiple authorities who are present, there are warlords, the government, which is also a player in such conflicts. And who are the people, who are the authorities people trust? Who do people go to is all a question mark. And things change so rapidly. People are moving, the context is changing. And Sarah mentioned about the weak theoretical foundation and no evidence base to create something. And that's very common. And that makes it very difficult for an evaluator to outline how change happens, or actually how change happened in an evaluation, looking back, because the context is so rapidly changing. Trust is a very key component here, where no one is neutral. Where we are talking about the governance, and some government officials are here. If you look at some conflict context, some governments are actually party to it. And there are, so I'm talking about biases. So as an evaluator, how could we play with those biases where we know that nobody is neutral? For example, if you specifically talk about peace building, programming, conflict transformation, and etc., then it becomes much more important. Like who's, what is the definition of change? Whose change definition should we trust? There is this risk of violence, which is very prominent. I have had some experiences like that, especially doing focus group discussions where you're gathering people together. So I think that's also something to keep an eye on. And then one thing that's also the shifting agendas of changing governments are mainly politically driven rather than data driven. So, for example, there was a recent example of a poverty reduction program in one of the fragile contexts. I know, I won't name it. The government shifted, the government changed, and the present government just finished the program, but without any data, without any performance evaluation, what was the reason behind it. And one thing that also Sarah touched upon is about the coordination and partnerships. So, when we specifically talk about SDG 16, which is about peace and, the institutions, inclusive institutions, and etc., a lot of us are gathering data, and this is actually a message to everybody, like the UN bodies, the World Bank, the development banks, the national and international universities, the civil society organizations and think tanks. We are all gathering data in these moving contexts, in these fragile contexts, but are we really sharing with each other? Not even. I have had so many challenges in accessing to just the conflict analysis in a context, because as evaluators, we are not conflict specialists, but we do have to be aware of what are the conflict triggers, what causes violence in a specific context. So, I can totally understand why people don't share, but then we may want to create a platform. And there is this amazing, this SDG 16 data initiative. There is this website as well where you can go and play with what data is available, and you can compare progress on SDG 16 indicators across countries. But then you will see when you select the fragile context, you will hardly find data compared to the more developed context. So there are these things, and York mentioned this regulations and laws around evaluation. So this lack of structure, process in place to carry out evaluation, this is a key. The capacity of the national evaluators are also something that that slows down the progress. And also there are these typical restricted access.
Yeah, who can we come back to the other things in the next question before we, yeah, on the third question? If you can
I'm done.
If you can hold on to them, or you want to finish the point?
No, that was it. I was explaining the soft and hard components that slows down the progress.
Yeah, thank you very much. Flavia, and also if you can come back a bit on the administrators you trained and what's the appetite they have for evaluations, and do you also discuss audits there, and how do they see these oversight mechanisms, and are there any neutral spaces where we can push this agenda?
Thank you, Vijaya. And when we're talking about the use of evaluation, effective use of evaluation, we're always talking about bringing evidence into policymaking. I think that's we could call it the same way. So I would my first top point on that would be to for us to try to understand which is the underlying fear of change in the environment, in the institutional environment in which we are. Do we have policy windows? Do we have shifts, as my colleague mentioned, my previous colleague mentioned? If you understand which is the fear of change and how you can find space to bring evidence to be really effective into policy making, I think that's a first thing to do. Coming from a government school, I would always focus in a constant and comprehensive way in building capacities. And not only building capacities to perform high quality evaluation, and not only building capacities to use, but to demand evaluation. As an institution in which I work, we lots of times receive demands from agencies and ministries that they cannot find the right question for evaluation. So we should help them to build the right question, which is the point they want to really evaluate, to really gather more evidence and data and things like that. So we should train people to demand, to use, and to perform. But I think especially to demand and incorporate evidence into policymaking. And I would slightly disagree with my colleague Georg about the existence of lots of institutions offering evaluation services. Because when we're talking about a reality like mine in Brazil, we are a very large country. And in fact, at federal level, we can say that we have lots of supply of institutions that are willing to provide evidence, the World Bank and GI and PNUD and the think tanks inside government and outside government. But we have 27 states and more than 5,000 municipalities where capacities are much more scarce. And if there are lots of people willing to talk to Marcelo in the Ministry of Economy, and so I want to perform an evaluation together with the Ministry of Economy in Brazil, there are much fewer institutions and evaluators willing to perform an evaluation at Crato in the northeast of the country. So one thing we have recently launched at the school in order to foster a culture of evaluation. And I think that should be our main target, building a culture of the use of evaluation in policymaking. We have recently launched an app. Some of you might be familiar with Tinder, which is a relationship app. And we have launched an app called Bora, which in Portuguese means let's go, let's do that, and to match evaluators and the public policy managers that are willing to have their policies evaluated. Because in the federal level, you have supply. In the state level, you might have supply for some cases, not for every case in a country like Brazil. But when you go to municipalities, you do not have supply of evaluators or institutions willing to perform evaluation. But sometimes you have people, students, PhD students, public policy students that are willing to perform an evaluation, but do not have access to data, to institutions to perform interviews and things like that. So these apps, call it Bora, we call it the Tinder of evaluation. But I always say that Tinder will become the Bora for personal relationships in the future. So I think that trying to foster a culture of use of evidence, it's imperative, and building capacity not only to perform, but to use effectively evaluation. I'd also add a last point here, taking advantage of the presence of 3 ministers in the room. The coordination in the core executive of the country is really very important as well. In Brazil, we have seen recent good advances in the last 6 or 7 years, at least, and what called the strategic level evaluation at federal government. But there was a strong coordination in the core executive of the country, and this was a differential for us to be in the stage we are. We have much more to improve, but the strategic coordination inside the core executive was really imperative for us.
Thank you, Flavia. With your permission, can we have one round of the participants' question? We have a third one, but maybe we covered quite a lot of points that would also border on to that third question. May I open the discussion? Anyone would like to have a question for the panelists or something you wish to share?
Bonjour tout le monde, je vais parler en français. Merci pour ces échanges très riches. Je suis Fama, je ne me suis pas présentée, Fama Diop Diaye du Sénégal. Je travaille au niveau de la Delivery Unit du Sénégal. Ma question s'adresse aux panélistes. J'ai beaucoup entendu Flavia, Madame Smith, parler de transparence. Et je voulais savoir à votre aujourd'hui, à votre niveau, quelle est la meilleure structure de gouvernance aujourd'hui pour un dispositif d'évaluation efficace? Pourquoi? Parce qu'aujourd'hui, on retrouve de plus en plus dans les ministères, dans mon pays en tout cas, des structures qui sont intégrées et qui sont censées mesurer l'évaluation du système. Est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, vous prenez plus la mise en place de structures indépendantes pour évaluer, faire appel à des auditeurs externes? En tout cas, comment aujourd'hui garantir la remontée d'informations fiables au niveau central pour mieux réorienter la prise de décision au niveau des politiques publiques? Je vous remercie.
Yes, thank all panelists and also to you for the excellent questions and discussion. I have many points to make, but I'd just like to ask Hoor whether I understood correctly that violence and fear for violence is actually a problem in organizing, say, more responsive modes of evaluation. And then perhaps the second question was, how do you provide safety on an institutional national level in order to be evaluations as they should be, which is critical.
Should we answer now or are we waiting?
Sorry, we are taking a few more questions.
Yeah, okay.
And then we'll have a quick translation of the question you posed before we move to the panelists. Yes, Masa.
Hello, thank you for the interesting discussion and also the Brazilian effort in creating a Tinder for evaluators and policymakers. But that is a kind of evaluation that the technocrats, the good ones, would demand in, for example, commissioning studies to the public think tank. Now, I was wondering, especially questions to your relating to democracy and maturity of society, who wants evaluations? Who are demanding evaluations? If you are talking about democracy and general public, I think, for example, you have a investigative journalism, which make more influence on the public opinion and policy formulation today. Now, I think today SNS democracy is also becoming a very big that would ask public to would make the public more demanding quick reaction to their policy questions rather than, okay, you make a question, wait for the evaluation, which will answer your question in 1 year's time. Right? So then there is also this technocrats who may be asking questions, which are the right questions, but do they want independence? Do they want rigor? To what extent? Is it an accountability mechanism, or they are asking for policy studies rather than evaluations? Then you may have a budget and finance people who may want to have discussions maybe at the parliament or within the ministries in deciding financial allocations or fiscal allocations to the ministries and different departments. So do they demand that? I was just wondering who wants evaluations from the demand side? Of course, there is also a supply side. We can create some interesting evaluations and create demand. That is not entirely impossible, but that doesn't build up the system itself unless you really have the demand identified. So I was wondering that question. Thank you.
Any last question before we go back to the panelists? May I now ask you to, any volunteers who would like to translate a question? Or would you repeat that now we all have headphones very quickly? Sorry for that. Can you please repeat your question? Can you hear her for interpretation? Can you hear? Is your microphone on? Yeah, it's.
Okay.
Can you hear now? I'm just interpreters.
Merci. Bon, je vois que les francophones sont minoritaires. J'ai un mauvais accent en anglais, donc je préfère parler français. Alors, la question était la suivante. Je souhaiterais savoir aujourd'hui quelle est la meilleure structure de gouvernance pour un système d'évaluation efficace. La question aujourd'hui, c'est vrai que l'auto-évaluation est très, c'est important, c'est primordial, mais également au niveau des structures, on se rend compte qu'il y a des systèmes d'évaluation qui se mettent en place. Comment on peut garantir aujourd'hui être juge et partie quelque part? Comment on peut garantir que les résultats remontés sont fiables, qu'on remonte au niveau central? C'est pour cela que je posais la question concernant la structure de gouvernance. Est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, avec les exemples que vous avez un modèle de gouvernance qui a marché, que vous conseillerez au pays? Voilà, je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for repeating the question again. 3-4 interesting questions, and maybe we can go back to the panel. I would also like to club the third question we had about going back to, I think seems to be a consensus that who is serious about evaluations, what they want about evaluations, what is the demand for, but if there are no evaluation systems, can governance processes co-opt this function? Because it seems to look increasingly difficult to set up the edifice of evaluations. So in the absence of it, what do we do? And how do we link to the governance processes? So I turn back to you, Flavia. Would you like to start, particularly the question Masa had about what the technocrats want, and on the other issues as well?
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. I think that everyone wants evaluation and nobody wants evaluation at the same time. And evaluation is not something very close to the human nature at the first approach. But I think the one hint I would give is try to understand the different interests behind every stakeholder, because civil society has an interest in evaluation, high-level officials have another interest, researchers have their interests, and bureaucracy have their own interests. So I think the key is to understand that different incentives should be in place for different stakeholders. I think I would say, and I would like to debate more with my colleagues from the panel and the audience, that it's almost impossible to have one only regime of incentives in place that satisfies every stakeholder that is involved in evaluation. And to have a sustainable evaluation system, as we call, I think the involvement of more stakeholders, especially outside governments, is essential. In the role I perform at Brazilian government, we have a strong focus on Brazilian bureaucracy. Brazilian bureaucracy is very strong and stable, and I think that alongside the years, there is a group of bureaucrats who have been taking evaluation seriously, and they have achieved mandates to change real things, to find room for a legislative framework, which is important but not sufficient. Maybe you have some legislation that does not have binding effects all the time. So legislation is necessary, but not sufficient most of the time. So I think you should focus on every group that's involved in evaluation, and broadening the number of the groups involved will help you have a more resilient and robust evaluation system. But at the same time, you should frame different narratives for this group, because only one regime of incentives won't be able to make everyone happy with evaluation, if this is at all possible.
Yes, I find this question super interesting, because not only because we have elections and independent judicial systems, the bureaucrats change their mind and say, wow, let's do evaluations. I love it. So the question is why? And I think um, um, in a democratic environment, there are many independent actors who demand and use evidence. Yeah, so you have independent research in a democracy. They will start doing research on public policy issues and they will publish their results. And policy is confronted with it. And you have similar thing with investigative journalism. They will also somehow use evidence, yeah, and confront politicians and bureaucrats with this evidence. And you have also parliament, which will independently demand kind of evidence for political reasons, but they will demand kind of, or they will use evidence. And at the local level, at least in many countries, you have citizens, yeah, who really they also kind of use evidence, very direct evidence of their ordinary living environment, yeah. And I think in a free environment of democracies, bureaucracies therefore will be confronted with tons of different challenging evidences. And as bureaucrats want order, they will kind of start to think of, okay, what is an alternative to having these different sources of chaotic evidence coming up on us? How do we kind of create a system where we kind of respond to the demands, but in a way that is kind of properly ordered? And I think this is the way when they start about, okay, how do we organize independent emergence of evidence, which we will then take up into our policy considerations. And that's where kind of the idea of evaluation regulation then emerges. So it's not a kind of an original kind of demand for independent evaluation, but it's rather that the environment in a free society creates pressures from different kinds of actors on bureaucracies, and they have to respond to that. That would be my interpretation. Yes.
In particular, is there an ideal government system that would promote effective evaluation system based on what kind of thing we?
I would suggest bringing civil society into the system. You cannot perform or consider an evaluation system without considering society, citizens, and their interests. And I think that you should also foster capacity among citizens to understand the evidence, to understand what's information, what's misinformation, when they are being victims of cherry picking of evidence. So if you inform population, and maybe the media should be involved somehow as they are strong. I am working with in a fellowship where one of the fellows that's taking the program with me, she's working on the project of bringing influencers to inform a population about public policy. So because they say they are a very strong source of information for most populations. So if they talk about fashion and about other things, they should talk about science and evidence and inform citizens about public policy issues and how they can interpret the findings that are brought to them by government and by media and by other stakeholders in place. So I think engaging society is mandatory, and thinking out of the box, who can help us to involve society to understand more how evidence really translates into their daily lives, into their options of policy options that are up to them in democratic context at least.
Thank you, Flavia. Jörg, any quick point before I go to Sarah and Ho?
The crucial issue for me is independence. If I would have to choose one standard, it would be independence. And you have to guarantee independence for evaluation. And I think this is the most crucial issue. All other things are very important, but if we all would have to choose one kind of basic criteria, then I would choose independence.
Thank you, Jörg. Shall we go to Sarah, please?
I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and I would agree with the panelists who've spoken, and in fact the sort of the conversation as a whole, that this is a combination of a window of opportunity, you put it, an institutional setup, and the demands and incentives across a complex governance system with many actors. And we've talked about those: civil society, media, parliament, and others. And in response to the lady who asked the question, I don't think there is necessarily one ideal system. I think systems or one ideal level necessarily. I think we have to think in terms of complexity of multiple actors and multiple levels. And within a given context and within a given political system, those will interact in a different way. But just as I finish, I would just also guard against perhaps, I would encourage pragmatism also, because I think there are some interesting examples in the types of countries where we work, where there is it's not necessarily highest on all the indicators of democracy. Maybe civic space is shrinking. Maybe there are issues around human rights, and yet there is still space around public policy evaluation and improving performance of government. And it's not a kind of either or, I don't think. I mean, clearly, democratic principles are important and fundamental, but even in contexts where perhaps those issues are not moving in the direction that some would want to see, there can still be spaces to improve public policy performance and the performance of governments and various actors. So I think amidst the incentives and the windows of opportunity and all the rest of it, I think a healthy dose of pragmatism is also important. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Over to you, Hur.
Yes, okay. Sorry, I just got lost in this very interesting discussion. I would say, further to what Jörg was mentioning around if we have to just take one principle, I would literally take participation as the one besides independence, of course. And this is actually to make sure that evaluations or the evidence that we gather are influential. They do make a change. They do have some sort of influence. And a way that we could ensure that is really to, first of all, understand who is it that is learning, whose learning is it, and where does it go? Majority of the evaluations are actually donor driven rather than problem driven. There is some sort of this, systemic thinking that we have to do to ensure the learning outputs, such as an evaluation report, is accessible to the people to whom that change really matters the most. And I kept an example from Uganda, where we engaged some youth-led evaluation during the LRA time because of some safety concerns. And those young people, once they presented at an event called African Child Day, one of the MP was there who then invited those young researchers, young evaluators, to come to the Ugandan parliament in Kampala and talk about the findings. It was about the child safety we did with the support of UNICEF. So literally, we don't know. Of course, as internationals, we pull out from the context we're breaking, but then we don't know what happened to those young people who became actually custodian of the data that they gathered, the findings they draw from it, and the recommendations that were actually their recommendations to really make some change happen. So, Jörg basically touched upon briefly on, journalism. So like the connection between the evaluation outputs and using, some countries have some strong journalist mechanisms in place. So like using local radios, using newspapers, and etc., finding ways that you can communicate the evidence to people, so people are involved in the change process, because it is, of course, the policies are made for them. I mean, you can, talk about inclusive governance and etc. And I would very, very quickly mention at the end of the evaluation, I recently wrote an article for the African Development Bank Evaluation Matters, the newsletter they publish. And it was all about closing the learning loop. And I am personally myself guilty of this, that when we conclude an evaluation, what we do is our dissemination workshops are organized in the capital cities, where we invite the the esteemed people, member of parliaments, and then some, some high flyers. But then that's done in capital cities, which are like far away. Like when we talk about big countries like India, Pakistan, Nigeria, etc. So they're most often they're like a bit detached. So, I mean, are we really going back to the same people from whom we are gathering data, from we are gathering information? Are we really closing that learning loop? And I think that is, I mean, one, it is their right to know what happened with the data you gathered from them. And then secondly, this is the way you could actually make them change makers, rather than just recipients of foreign or national aid. And then finally, I would just respond to the question asked by one of the participants around the safety. I mean, one can talk about it forever, but I mean, literally my key message here is that the safety and security of the people involved in evaluation, either they are the national or local evaluators, the enumerators, or the participants of evaluation, supersedes any kind of accountability measure. We have seen and experienced a lot of things that have gone wrong, especially in evaluation, or even broader, like in development intervention. So literally start from the context and make sure that in a conflict environment, conflict sensitivity is the starting point, and you develop a conflict sensitive evaluation metrics, which means your evaluation framework, the methods you choose, the tools, the questions are conflict sensitive, so that we don't cause any issues to the already affected population. And then one additionally important point is making sure the local acceptance is there, making sure, I mean, there is a lot of conversation going on at the moment about this decolonizing evaluation in the evaluation spheres. So making sure like that we know what are the learning methods of the people, of the local people, what are the methods people speak up about their issues, people speak about the things they want to see, or like, more evaluative evidence kind of thing. So these are the points. And one last thing, sorry, is about the technology. Very recently with the COVID-19 crisis, where we saw that access became a big challenge. We came up, I mean, the technological approaches were already there in terms of remote evaluation, remote data collection. But then it emerged quite a lot in COVID-19 situation. So, but we should be aware of the new risk that they carry. So making sure that we are aware of that. So with that, I think I'll conclude. Thank you. Over to you, Vijaya.
Thank you so much. Hur, if we could take that also as your concluding remarks, because the organizers are reminding us that we are far run out of the time. So may I ask for the concluding remarks of the other panelists? Sarah, your concluding remarks. I know a young UNDP colleague has a question, but probably you can continue discussing with Flavia and Yog here, and myself will also join. Sarah, over to you for your concluding remarks. You may take a minute or two.
Oh, thank you very much. I actually thought I'd already given my concluding remarks. So as we're running short of time, just to thank everybody for a very stimulating conversation. There was actually I thought there was remarkable consensus on the panel. I wasn't sure that there would be, totally actually. But I was surprised how all of us coming from quite different perspectives actually share a common understanding around evaluation and its place within public policy, and how to support it in terms of a combination of windows of opportunity, institutional setup, incentives, and demand. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Over to you, Jörg.
I'm always suspicious if there is too much consensus. So I would say I really like the heterogeneous conversation. I noted some non-consensus, and I'm glad about that and enjoyed the panel. Thank you.
Consensus within non-consensus. Okay.
Thank you again. I would only say, understand your institutional environment and the conditions in place, and bring the stakeholders together, understand that all of them will have different incentives to take part in instrumental use and demand for evaluation, and try to think out of the box when considering solutions to foster a culture where evaluation is really present. I think that's all.
Thank you so much. I think this is such a rich discussion. I won't even try to summarize it. So many interesting points. I would just like to share with you, our office is also, of course, in collaboration with Sarah Lister on the program side. We are trying to bring out two publications, one on evaluation and governance interface. The other one is also on data governance, particularly from the point of view of governance, SDG 16. And of course, we will be reaching out to some of you, and we like to see some of these thoughts come into that publication as well, as contributions from some of you. Please do reach out to us if you're interested in developing or bringing any perspective as an article to this book. I will stop here and thank you so much to the panelists. Such a fascinating discussion. I really would like to take forward that with you one-to-one. And thank you so much to all the participants for your insightful questions and for taking your time to engage in this. Thank you very much.